In today's video, I'm going to talk about the art of a good reference photo as well as reflecting on my recent trip to Big Bend National Park. Before I jump into my painting, I wanted to show you a moment where I was painting in Big Bend, looking at the mountains and doing a quick wash study, mostly to capture the colors that I was experiencing in person in order to help me create notes for the future. Because although I think reference photos are incredibly helpful, especially the ease of having them on your phone, I also know the limitations. And in today's video, I'm going to talk about those limitations, why there is some stigma around using your iPhone and painting from those reference photos, and ultimately how you can use the accessibility of phones, as well as understanding the limitations of working from photos so that you can have a practice and ultimately a reference photo setup that works best for you. In my college painting classes, we had to paint from life for several semesters before we could even begin to paint from reference photos. And even then, it was master studies. And then we were even encouraged to paint from life. I think exceptions were given in kind of extreme circumstances, but I did almost all of my college capstone and upper level work painting from life, painting plein air specifically. And as my college painting professor described it to us, whenever you're working from a photo, you're allowing your image and the camera to make certain formal choices for you that you may or may not be aware of. And what he meant by this in layman's terms was whenever you take a photo, there are a couple things happening to the image that you're working from that fundamentally change them. One of them, of course, is cropping. It's going to limit what you look at. If you've ever painted plein air, which is where you're just sitting outside somewhere and painting directly what you see, you realize that the way your two eyes sort of perceive the world is vastly different from the way a singular lens on a camera perceives the world. And although they are similar, especially if you're not painting from it, it doesn't seem to be a big difference. When you're actually sitting in front of a landscape and painting it, it actually is pretty dramatically different. If you doubt me, I would say go try it, go paint from a window, go sit outside and sketch, and you'll notice that, especially compositionally, there's a lot of difference. And so whenever you take a photo, there is compositional choices being made. Whether you like those or not, it's up to you, but there definitely is a difference. The other thing is that your values and colors are compressed because of the technology of your camera. Even a nice camera is going to compress what you're looking at into pixels. Oftentimes, I find that the values are compressed in a way that doesn't really fully depict what you're looking at from life. And similarly, the thing I have found over my more than decade painting, especially professionally, and having a plein air practice of my own, is that the colors are sort of never done full justice whenever I work from a photo. Now, don't get me wrong. Here's my case for why I think reference photos are fantastic and why ultimately more of my practice is made from reference photos. Now, this all starts in the beginning of my career post grad. And I remember I still had this very purist view of painting from life because that's all I knew in college. And so for about a year and a half, I didn't paint. And there, of course, was other factors to that year and a half of artist block. But the biggest one was I didn't have the time, energy, and space to set up still lifes or go plein air painting. And so I didn't paint at all. And I remember thinking that if the choice was between painting from a photo versus not painting at all, I didn't want to choose not painting. And what ended up happening was my years of painting from life allowed me to make better photographic choices when selecting my reference photos that ultimately helped me. The first thing, of course, is the composition and the cropping. And by being more intentional of what I'm looking at and allowing my camera, even the camera on my iPhone, to be a tool and intentionally making choices when cropping, sometimes what this means is I'll open a folder and put 3 or 4 of almost identical photos in it together, and maybe afterwards stitch together in Procreate all of those images to create something more true to form, because I'm aware of the difference from having a practice of using both. And certainly most of the time, I allow the cropping of my iPhone when I'm taking a photo to be something that I'm considering for whenever I do decide to go in and make it a painting. And the other thing, the compression of the values and colors, I have learned to take notes in my phone. So I will have my reference photos in a note on my iPhone note app, and I will write the way I'm seeing the colors. So you can go and watch my color theory for beginners video where I talk about sort of using color coordinates instead of descriptive color words. And what I do is I sort of use that system. It's kind of a moon cell system if you're a color nerd and know what that means. But and I will write notes of how I'm seeing the color And that way, when inevitably you look at your photo and it's a lot more compressed, gray, dull than what you're seeing and experiencing in real life, I remember that, oh, it was a muted sort of orange, low intensity warm orange. That was the kind of color star of the show, if you will. And by jumping back into that lens, even if it's been weeks later, I'm able to sort of remember using my reference photo and these notes to jump into my painting and sort of correct for what the camera loses in that process. Another thing you can do is you can also manipulate the photo while you're sitting directly in front of your reference. So, I'm sure anyone, whether or not you are an artist or not, has had this experience where you go and take a picture of, I always think of a supermoon as a good example of this, or like a really beautiful sunset. You take a picture with your phone and then you look at it right away and you see how different your photo is from what you're actually looking at. It's often, I find that it tends to fall a little bit flat. And one of the things I'll do in this moment is I will go in and I will edit. Sometimes it's bumping saturation, sometimes it's manipulating the exposure and the contrast and the values to get it to match to the best of my ability what I'm looking at. It's not always perfect, and ultimately that's why I choose to paint. I always tell people at my most basic level, I'm trying to make what I'm looking at match what I saw in my paintings, and oftentimes that means getting kind of far away from my reference in that case. Another thing you can do if this is accessible to you, a lot of times people use reference photos because what you're looking at is very quick. Maybe you can't afford to spend a lot of time in front of it, and all of those things are incredibly valid. Again, the emphasis on this video is if you only have access to reference photos to paint from, how can you sort of bridge the gap? But if you do have time, I also would recommend making color studies or value studies. And these are, again, studies aren't just informal paintings. They really are meant to be kind of an exploration of what you're looking at. And so gridding off a piece of watercolor paper and then doing a quick value study, which is where you just use grayscale, so black and white, as well as a very limited study kind of comparing in this instance, maybe the color of the mountains versus the sky versus the foliage in the foreground, and just playing around with arranging those, maybe playing with the saturation and the value until you have your study organized in a way that mimics what you're looking at versus your reference. Because I find that with reference photos, that's the thing that often gets compressed. Again, the values usually are a little bit off, not a big deal, but the order of color is often pretty manipulated. And again, notes can help. It's not a lost cause if you don't have access to sitting in front of something for potentially 20-30 minutes. But if you can organize that really is going to help you in this process, because you can have all these things organized in a folder on your phone, or if it's easier, you can print them out and tape them to your easel. But having those things will help you to sort of rediscover what you liked about your composition in the first place. Another tip that's maybe a little more pertinent if you are painting portrait or something that's sort of moving is something I learned during the pandemic. I tend to go to a local realism atelier in Austin, and part of what these kind of hardcore traditionalist classic painters loved is painting from life. And so one of the instructors took a recording of a model over the span of 2 hours and all of her subtle shifting that happens when you paint a live model, and the painters would paint from the video and not a photo. Obviously, there's still limitations, but I thought that this was a great solution if that's accessible to you. Ultimately, whether you're doing color studies, manipulating your reference photo, or combining multiple photos in something like Photoshop or Procreate to create a new image that better reflects the experience in person, all of those things can be wonderful tools, and I'm a really big proponent that a reference photo can be a helpful tool. The last thing I'll say is that you can pour into your photography skills and develop that as a separate practice. That's what I've tended to do over the years, and combining a little bit of all those different techniques. And I feel like it's given me a better relationship with my reference photos and ultimately with all of my paintings, especially those that really seek to capture a lifelike sense of reality in my references. I hope you enjoyed today's video and watching this painting come together. Make sure to like and subscribe if you want to see more educational painting content, and check out my online art school, Not Sari Art School, if you'd like to take your painting practice to the next level. I'll talk to you guys next week.